If you walked into a cabin in the mountains and found a room so violent it looked like the walls themselves had panicked, but in the next bedroom, children had slept through the night unharmed, what would you believe happened there? Random intruders, a targeted attack, or something even worse, someone the family already knew? Before we go any further, drop your first theory in the comments, because this case doesn't just ask who killed the people inside cabin 28. It asks how a crime this brutal could sit in a small town for decades without ever fully closing. The Keddie cabin murders begin in Northern California, in the tiny resort community of Keddie, where cabins sat among trees and railroad lines and the kind of mountain quiet that feels peaceful until something breaks it. In April of 1981, Sue Sharp is staying in cabin 28 with several of her children and a family friend, and from the outside it looks like an ordinary spring night in a place where neighbors know each other just enough to wave and then disappear back into their own lives, which is exactly why what happens next feels like the town lost its innocence in a single room. Here is the first 30 seconds of real tension, because the horror of this case is not only in the murders, it is in the timing. Sometime during the night or in the early morning hours, Sue Sharp, her teenage son John, John's friend Dana Wingate, and Sue's daughter Tina are attacked inside that cabin. But when the crime scene is finally discovered, Tina is not there. And in the rooms nearby, 3 younger children, plus another boy sleeping over, are found alive, untouched, and somehow unaware enough to make the whole event feel impossible, as if violence selected one part of the house and left the other in silence. When the bodies are discovered, the scene is so chaotic that even people used to hard cases later describe it with a kind of disbelief, because Sue, John, and Dana are found in the living room, tied, beaten, and stabbed. And parts of the scene suggest multiple weapons and more than one stage of violence, which immediately pushes the investigation away from a simple burglary gone wrong and towards something more personal, more emotional, more deliberate. Yet for all the rage in the room, there are also odd traces of control. Things done in sequence, things moved, findings that suggest someone took time where panic should have ruled, and that contradiction becomes one of the central puzzles of the whole case. Pattern interrupt. If this were only about the 3 found in the cabin, it would already be one of the darkest, unsolved crimes in California. But Tina Sharp's absence changes the entire gravity of the story, because now you do not just have a murder scene, you have a missing child attached to it. And that means every theory must stretch across 2 questions at once: who carried out the attack and what happened after, when one victim was no longer in the room. For years, that missing piece keeps the case from settling into a single explanation, because a killer who leaves 3 bodies behind but takes one with them is not thinking like someone who simply lost control for a few minutes. To understand why suspicion moved quickly toward people in and around the family, you have to look at the shape of the night before. Sue Sharp was recently separated and trying to rebuild life for her children. The cabin was not wealthy or polished. It was lived in, temporary in feeling, the kind of place where people came and went, where friends, visitors, and acquaintances were not unusual. That matters because it means familiarity could walk through that door without immediately looking dangerous. And in a case where several people are attacked in close quarters without waking the whole cabin into chaos, familiarity is not a small detail. It is one of the biggest. The investigation from the beginning was burdened by what too many cold cases share: a crime scene contaminated by people entering before it was fully controlled, early assumptions made too quickly, and evidence that either was not processed with enough urgency or was interpreted through the wrong lens. This is where long-form true crime gets honest. Not every unsolved mystery stays unsolved because the killer was brilliant. Some stay unsolved because the first days were mishandled just enough to let the truth slip sideways. Cabin 28 becomes one of those cases where later investigators, journalists, and family members keep returning to the same frustration. There were leads, there were names, there were warning signs, and still the case drifted. Among the names that kept circling back were men allegedly connected to Sue Sharp in ways that made investigators and later researchers look hard at motive, jealousy, intimidation, and control. Two names in particular would shadow the case for years, and what makes them so haunting is not only that people found them suspicious, but that some accounts suggested they had behavior, statements, and histories that should have forced a harder, cleaner push early on. One of the most repeated claims attached to the suspect lane is that a hammer and a knife linked by circumstance or testimony floated near the edges of the inquiry, and that one of the men allegedly made comments after the murders that sounded less like grief and more like knowledge. That does not make a conviction, but it does explain why the case never stopped pointing back toward people who seemed too close to dismiss. Now, here is the open loop that keeps viewers watching, because every great unresolved case has one detail that refuses to sit quietly: Tina Sharp. 3 years after the murders, hundreds of miles away from Keddie, partial remains believed to be hers are discovered in a remote area, and that discovery changes the emotional temperature of the case all over again. It confirms the worst fear, that she had not simply fled or survived the night and vanished into another story, and it raises a harder one. Why was she taken away from Cabin 28 at all? If the crime was rage, why remove one victim? If it was personal, why leave the others where they fell? If there were multiple offenders, what role did each one play once they left that cabin? Every answer opens a second question. At this point, some people watching will be thinking, this sounds like two crimes forced into one file: a brutal cabin massacre and a separate abduction. That instinct makes sense, but the stronger reading is usually the simpler one. That the same event stretched beyond the cabin, and that whoever did this had a plan after the violence, whether that plan was to hide Tina, silence Tina, or control the narrative of what happened inside the house. And when you start looking at the case that way, the room itself begins to read differently. Not as random frenzy, but as an attack with a purpose the public still cannot fully see. Another reason this story holds attention is the setting. Keddie was not Los Angeles. It was not San Francisco. It was a small mountain community where rumor moves fast, where law enforcement resources were not endless, where people know just enough about one another to feel sure before they are certain. In those places, a case can become trapped between official investigation and local mythology. Everyone thinks they know. Nobody can prove enough. And over time, the story hardens into a shape that feels permanent. The Keddie murders became exactly that: a crime everybody remembered, a solution nobody could land cleanly. Years later, renewed attention to the evidence and renewed criticism of the early handling gave the case new oxygen. Investigators revisited physical evidence, reconsidered old suspect statements, and looked at whether leads once treated as background should have been front and center from the start. This is the part where modern audiences often expect a breakthrough montage, but real cold case work is rarely cinematic. It is rereading, retesting, re-asking, pulling one old contradiction at a time and seeing what still holds. Sometimes that process gives you a confession, sometimes it gives you a stronger theory, sometimes it only tells you how much the first chance mattered. And still, the Keddie case refuses to die because it has too many details that feel like unfinished sentences. Children left alive nearby, a missing victim later found far away, a crime scene both chaotic and deliberate, suspect names that never stop surfacing, and a sense hard to prove, impossible to ignore, that someone in or around that community knew much more than was ever said out loud. This is where the emotional weight of the story lives, not just in the violence, but in the possibility that the truth was always close enough to touch and the system still let it cool. So, what do I think method over myth? I do not think Cabin 28 was random. I do not think strangers wandered in, committed that level of targeted violence, removed one victim, and dissolved into the night without some connection to the family or to the rhythms of that cabin. The shape of the crime leans personal. Rage mixed with familiarity, control mixed with improvisation, and a confidence that only comes when the people inside are not fully unknown to you. Whether that means one dominant offender and one follower, or two people acting in a shared plan, is where the case still fractures for me. But random chance has always felt like the weakest explanation in the room. And here's the second pattern interrupt before we close. One of the reasons this case still grips people is that it forces an ugly truth about justice. Sometimes a community can feel a crime in its bones and still fail to convert that feeling into something a court can use. Suspicion is not proof. Proof, mishandled, becomes memory. Memory over decades becomes frustration. That is why cases like Keddie last, not because they are unknowable, but because they were damaged before they were resolved. So now I want your verdict. Which single detail decides it for you? The children sleeping through the night, Tina being taken from the cabin, the suspect names that kept resurfacing, or the early mistakes that may have wrecked the best chance to solve it? Drop your theory in the comments, share this with the friend who always catches the one detail everyone else overlooks, and if this held you through the first minute, the fifth, and now the final stretch, subscribe to Caseboard Daily because next time we open another file where the smallest overlooked piece might be the only thing still telling the truth.